Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of global food systems. It's produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University. I'm Jay Weeks, PhD candidate in the Department of Agronomy. My co-host is Scott Zanona, an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy who specializes in the philosophy of science. Welcome back, everybody. Often in popular culture, agricultural fertilizers get a bad rap. While their use definitely does have the potential to come in an environmental cost through promotion of algal blooms or emission of greenhouse gases, the truth is these amendments are necessary to produce the abundant and affordable food supply that many of us around the world enjoy today. To discuss the ins and outs of soil nutrient management, we spoke with Dr. Nathan Nelson. Dr. Nelson is a professor of soil fertility and nutrient management here at Kansas State University. A native of Manhattan and an avid outdoorsman, he possesses a strong interest in developing agricultural systems that not only maximize productivity, but protect environmental quality as well. Our discussion in this episode covers how and why farmers make the fertilizer decisions that they do, and what that means for water quality. Dr. Nelson directs the Kansas Agricultural Watershed Field Laboratory, a unique 18-plot watershed project to better understand how cover cropping and fertilizer application practices impact phosphorus dynamics on Kansas no-till fields. Scott, John, and I had a great conversation talking with Nathan. Having known him for a number of years, I always appreciate the points of view that he brings to agricultural research. I think you will too. Enjoy. Dr. Nathan Nelson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to the discussion.
So I typically do a small intro before the podcast even begins, but in your own words, what's a little bit about your background? How'd you get here?
Sure, yeah. I've always been really interested in conservation and natural sciences since, a young age. I grew up on a very, very small farm just outside of Manhattan, Kansas here, but spent a good portion of my younger years up through high school spending summers on my grandfather's dairy, which is out in Utah, out in the western states. I was familiar with agriculture and things like that, but really passionate about conservation and ecology and environmental things. Actually went to school, started off in a conservation kind of biology type program, and did a lot of work looking at natural resource conservation like parks and wildlands and things like that. And it didn't take me too long to realize that a lot of that was managing people and their access to natural resources, whereas in agriculture, you're managing the natural resources. And agriculture quickly became much more interesting to me. It was always familiar to me, but now very interesting as really the number one user of natural resources. I still feel fairly passionate that it is our most important use of natural resources. It feeds us, and we need to conserve it and make sure that we protect the resources, the soil resources that we have, as well as the water resources, everything that goes around it, so that we can continue to provide food sustainably. And so that's kind of the background of where I got into. Then I came to Kansas State actually here, spent a few years here, finished up an undergraduate degree here at Kansas State, went to North Carolina State for master's and PhD in soil science, and worked in soil fertility, nutrient management, a lot with the animal industry in North Carolina, and then moved out to Idaho, in Kimberly, Idaho, near Twin Falls. Worked for the USDA in their irrigation and soils research lab, and then moved back here to Kansas State. So kind of made a little bit of tour of the nation and ended back up at home.
Was it were you seeing environmental degradation and things? Is that what got you really interested in it, or just enjoyed the outdoors and being part of it and wanted to conserve it for the future?
Sure, some of both. I've enjoyed the outdoors and really enjoyed doing that. But then at the same time, I saw some degradation, and some of this when I was a kid. I don't want to throw my dad under the bus, but he came from a different mentality, and we had a burn pile and things that got spread out on the land, and when there was some trash that didn't know what to do with, you found a gully and it stopped some erosion, and I thought, well, that's one way to do it, but maybe there's a better way. And we still have good discussion. There was one time when he actually dumped a bunch of sheetrock in a landfill. And then later on, he says, well, he learned that was a good soil amendment. And I said, well, yeah, but you weren't using it that way. Anyway, so.
Was it covered in leaded paint?
No, it wasn't covered in leaded paint, but still I was like, come on. Gypsum can be a good can be a good soil amendment, but anyway.
Not all in one place.
Not all in one place
big
where it's going to
pieces
get
of
washed
sheetrock,
away
right?
in the next big rainstorm. But anyway, so some of that, and I kind of just noticed, I said, well, there's probably a better way to manage some of these resources. And I was pretty passionate about keeping things clean. I enjoyed using fishing and outdoors and water, but wanted to see cleaner water.
So you were working with the animal industry as a grad student. What was that project? What were you doing?
A few different projects. Mainly, first I was looking at ways to process swine lagoon effluent to recover phosphorus from it. So looked at precipitating out struvite, which is a magnesium ammonium phosphate mineral, which it can precipitate out naturally. We were trying to enhance that precipitation and then recover the product. So that was a lot of fun, and looked at that as a nutrient source for plants, as a fertilizer. Then I started looking at phosphate leaching in sandy soils, typical of the North Carolina coastal plain, to try and make some estimates of how fast it was moving, what soil properties affected its leaching, and if this phosphate leaching was actually going to maybe become an environmental problem years down the road. So looked at that.
So a lot of work with phosphorus. Why phosphorus?
It was a little bit what it's available, but also I was quite interested in phosphorus because it plays a pretty big role in water quality and algal blooms and so forth. If you get too much phosphorus in fresh water, you can get algal blooms and fish kills and some other things. So there was an environmental side to this that I was interested in trying to keep it out of the water, but at the same time, it's incredibly important for our agricultural production. So we need this nutrient. It's pretty important for the farms, and it just kind of made a good blend of my interests of agriculture and conservation and protecting water quality.
Nathan, help a rookie or a novice out here. When you refer to soil fertility, what are you actually speaking about?
So for me, soil fertility is, I'm going to say it is a pretty broad field, but basically nutrient management, managing nutrients in agroecosystems, if you want to kind of be specific. But so that would include both on the fields as well as that area around the fields and water draining off of the fields, that whole system. We're looking at managing the nutrients to maximize sustainable production of agriculture and minimize any negative effects. And so this would go for any nutrient, increasing. So part of this is an understanding of the cycling in the soils, cycling through plants. So there's a nutrient cycling side of this. Fertilizer management, so what sources of fertilizer, how to place them, how to time them appropriately. So it's the fertilizer management as well. And then some crop management and best management practices to keep that nutrient in the field. So it's that entire dynamic, pretty broad area, more than just fertilizers.
And does that conversation or does that subject cover anti-nutrients as well? High salt concentrations in soil and the like?
Sure. Sure. High salts, maybe some toxicities and things like that.
Right.
Those would fall into soil fertility. But salts will also go into some soil physics and stuff, because that does in some of these things bridge into some other areas. Because high salt content often relates back to or deals with soil physical properties and irrigation and some other things that bring in some other areas of soil science beyond just soil fertility. But the same thing, soil fertility brings in some things from soil microbiology and there's overlap between all these disciplines. Yeah.
Great,
So,
thanks.
so is the fertility just about like mostly delivery of nutrients to the plants then? Is when you use the word fertility as opposed to other ways in which the plants are affected in their health?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Primarily nutrient delivery. Yeah.
So not everybody that listens will be familiar with like fertilizer application and things like that, right? I mean, fertilizers get thrown into the agrochemical category, and they get lumped in with pesticides and herbicides and that sort of thing. How does a farmer make a decision about what fertilizers to use? What goes into a fertilizer application?
Sure. Yeah. So, every farmer, in general, you're going to be looking at what your plant needs, and can it get that nutrient from their basic building blocks: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Then you've got calcium, magnesium. You can go through the whole list of elements that plants need to acquire out of the soil. And so you're going to look at what the soil can supply. And if the soil can't supply it, you're going to look at some other way to supply that nutrient. Could be through manure, could be from fertilizer, could be changing cropping systems to improve availability of some nutrient, or it could be just changing cropping systems to choose a crop that may be tolerant of a deficiency. So there's a variety of different things. Primarily, producers add nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and then some micronutrients. And when they make their decisions there, they're going to look at the crop that they're growing, the system that they're in. If they're irrigated, it's a little bit different than dry land. Their yield potential, their soils and climate, make some estimate of how much nutrient they're going to need, and then choose a fertilizer source. And their choice there's going to be some personal preference. There's going to be some equipment, some management styles. A lot of different decisions go into exactly what fertilizer and nutrient source they're going to choose. So there are a lot of things. It's hard to say this is exactly what every farmer does. They're all going to do something different.
Sure, but there are tests that farmers can do, right, to determine or estimate how much of some nutrients that is available to plants before they make those sorts of applications?
Sure, yeah. There are soil analyses, and we highly recommend producers to analyze their soil. And a lot of them do. Some don't. Some make recommendations based on that. A lot do. I think the good the producers that are progressive are going to pay quite close attention to those analyses, because that's going to help them make sure that they're not spending extra money on fertilizer that they shouldn't, or they're not losing some yield because they don't have enough nutrient, things like that.
So I wanted to ask you along these lines, how fertilizing has changed over time. You were talking about sort of your dad being kind of old school, right? And then you're also mentioning concerns about phosphorus leaching, right? Where there you were talking about specifically from the waste pools, right? But this is a general concern that's, I don't know how long it's been, but sort of increasing attention to, right, fertilizer runoff, right, leading to algae blooms and things like that, right? So could you say something a little bit about like how techniques have changed over time, or how much awareness has changed, right? So in the farmer's mind, is it mostly about cost, like you don't want to over fertilize because you spent too much, versus attending to the concerns about, right, overnutrients, right, in the elsewhere?
Sure. So if we go back 50, 60, 70 years, really that's when fertilizers really started becoming more prevalent in agriculture. Initially, yields were a little bit lower. They were growing crops that worked, that they were mining a lot of the nutrient out of the soil, right? So when people first started applying these fertilizers, a lot of the focus in soil fertility was on finding the right rate and actually helping producers make sure that they're maximizing yield. Okay. Initially, and for quite a while, fertilizers tended to have a lower and fairly steady cost. And with that lower, steadier cost, the idea was there wasn't a downside of applying too much, or you'd want to make sure you had enough. And so there was a lot of building up the soil. Building soil fertility was a lot of the very common mentality, and to do that with fertilizers. And And then at the same time, you had a lot of manure, and that's what people had been using. Bulky, kind of stinky, kind of tough to manage. And with this new fertilizer that came along that was really nice and handy to manage, somewhat the manures kind of maybe fell out of fashion a little bit, right? And people looked at that more as a waste product. And so there was a period of time where you had a lot of nutrients in manure that were really viewed as a waste and trying to get rid of it. Your objective in managing that was to get rid of it because you had this easy fertilizer that was cheap. And then not a whole lot of attention to losses. Now, over time, we've realized that, oh no, there are some issues with loss, and that can cause some problems in water bodies, groundwater as well as surface water, as well as salt water, and also fertilizer prices have, in the last 10 years, become a lot more erratic. Some spikes have gone up, and they've been quite expensive.
Why is that?
I'm going to have to speculate on that one. Is it exactly why? I think
it's got to be complicated. Yeah.
It's complicated, and part of it has to do with I think we're moving more towards a world market where the U.S. doesn't control so much of the fertilizer market, and you have other countries with a lot of purchasing power, and then all of a sudden, back in the 60s when we were the number one user of a lot of this stuff and supplier, we controlled the market, steady prices. It's more than that, though, probably, but that's part of it. Anyway, so there are a lot of factors that went into this, but you had a little bit more of erratic prices, and that has stayed about true. They haven't really stabilized a whole lot. They've stable, so producers are a little bit more interested, especially in the last 10 years. Producers are more interested in the economic side of managing it and not over-applying fertilizers.
So I want to get to a couple things. One, I want to talk more about the ways in which fertilizer is lost, right? Because people have a lot of concerns about getting into groundwater or into freshwater bodies or stuff like that. But first, could you say a little bit more about the issues surrounding manure and fertility and why manure application is more complicated than it might seem outright, right?
Sure, yeah. It really comes down to the concentration and the physical state, right? So our fertilizers are highly concentrated nutrient sources. I mean, some of them we're looking almost 50% of the product is the nutrient that we're interested in, whereas in manures you might be 1%, 2%, 3%, pretty diluted from a nutrient standpoint. So you have to add a lot of it, and then it's difficult to know how much nutrient is in the manure, right? So manure is by nature very heterogeneous.
Yeah, because it depends on what they eat, right?
Depends upon what they eat, and depends upon how the bedding is mixed with it, and it depends upon what manure source you're looking at, from one farm to the next, from one animal to the next, whatever. Some are a little bit more consistent, and some are very inconsistent. So there's a little bit of a guessing game with how much nutrient is there. And then the availability is different because a lot of that nutrient is in an organic form that has to mineralize before the plant can use it. And it's a little bit hard to know exactly how fast that process is going to go. So that has to do with soil and temperature and moisture and other things. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how much nutrient is there. And it's a low concentration, so it's more expensive to haul. You have to have different equipment to apply it. So all of those factors kind of come into it. It's a little bit more difficult to manage.
Are there upsides to it in terms of the physics of the soil and
Sure,
that
yeah.
sort of thing?
There are definitely some upsides to it, and there's a lot of organic matter that can really improve the soil. You get a wide variety of nutrients, some micronutrients and some other things that can help replenish the soil. You get some areas we're running into some sulfur deficiencies, but if you're using manure, you don't have to because it supplies some other nutrients that you're maybe not counting on. So there are definitely some upsides.
And this stuff is becoming a greater concern as livestock operations sort of become more and more concentrated in certain parts of the country, right?
Yeah. So as the livestock operations become concentrated, you get a lot more manure in one area, and then to distribute that at agronomic rates, you have to haul it further, right, from the source. Furthermore, the livestock industry itself tends to become concentrated in certain areas. Like there's an area where there's a lot of chickens or broilers produced. This area here has a lot of turkeys, maybe somewhere else, and then somewhere else there's a lot of hogs in this place. So, and they tend to concentrate together, a lot of those farms together, and so then you get, again, more of those nutrients all in one area.
An example would be like the Chesapeake Bay, right, where they have a lot of poultry operations and things like that.
Yeah, a lot of poultry out there. So you truck all the grain in, which has a more concentrated nutrient content in it. Animals eat the grain, and then you're left with the nutrients in the manure, and it's tough to get enough money to haul that back out where the grain came from.
And so when you're talking about the different types of animals, that means different types of nutrients and sort of different qualities of the manure too, right? Is that
monogastric versus?
Yeah, very different from when you go from like poultry to swine to beef. Very different amount of nutrient. They get different feed. They process the nutrients differently in their bodies. Ruminants like cattle can use a lot of the phosphorus, particularly. So I'm talking a little bit more about phosphorus here, but a lot of the phosphorus in some of these grains is in the form of phytate.
I was going to ask that question.
And so the cattle can use that form of phosphorus, whereas the swine and the chickens cannot. And so then they end up supplementing swine feed and poultry feed with other phosphorus forms because those animals can't use the phytate. So there are different ways to get around that as well. But anyway, those are just some of the details, some examples of why there are differences from one animal to the next.
Getting back to the losses, what are the main ways in which fertilizers or nutrients are lost into other aspects of the environment, and how does that relate to the environmental quality issue?
Sure. I'll try and do this without giving you my week-long lecture for soil fertility. But it really depends quite a bit on which nutrient you're talking about. The main nutrients that we're concerned about from a loss standpoint are generally nitrogen and phosphorus, and the loss mechanisms and pathways are very different for nitrogen and phosphorus. Quick overview: nitrogen can be lost through gaseous forms as ammonia or as nitrous oxide, so both of which can have some environmental implications in air quality. Nitrogen can also be leached as nitrate, and that leaching can move it into deep groundwater, or it can move it in through shallow groundwater into surface water from a base flow kind of mechanism. And that depends upon the hydrology and of the area where you are. If you're out in western Kansas, where we don't have a whole lot of rivers, but we have a lot of groundwater, deep groundwater, a lot of this moves down into the groundwater.
And the type of soil matters too, right? If you got a sandy soil, it might move more quickly, whereas a high clay soil, it's more slowly, right?
Is one type of loss worse than the other? Is moving to deep groundwater more worrying or more difficult to handle or deal with than another type of loss?
It depends upon the water use and so forth, because we've got some cities in western Kansas that have to treat their water to, if you have nitrate concentration higher than 10 parts per million nitrogen, then that's above the drinking water limit, and you have to treat that, or it can cause some negative impacts on human health. So they're going to have to treat that to get the nitrate out, because they're pumping groundwater. But that exact same problem occurred for the Des Moines waterworks, and they were pumping water out of surface water, right? And so it kind of depends upon where that water is being used, right, and what you're going to have to do with it. If it goes into surface water and it moves down the Mississippi out into the Gulf of Mexico or in the Chesapeake Bay or into salt water, then it can cause, then it can be an agent in eutrophication. Salt water tends to be nitrogen limited, so you add nitrogen. You're basically fertilizing, and it's pretty simple. Add these nutrients to soil, we get higher growth. Add these nutrients to water, you get higher growth. It's just you're growing algae, not crops.
If you add it, they will grow, sure.
Yep, sure.
And what's the problem with the algae growing?
Changes the ecosystem, right? The whole process referred to as cultural eutrophication, or sometimes just eutrophication, is basically you increase the fertility status, so you have more algal growth. You'll favor some algae species over others, and sometimes some of those algae species can cause problems. There's some toxic algae, some that release toxins. Anyway, so might be a shift in the type of algae, but overall you get more algae. Those algae die, then they decompose. In the decomposition process, it can reduce the amount of oxygen. The microorganisms that decompose biomass are very efficient at pulling oxygen out of the water. So they'll pull a lot of the oxygen out, and then the oxygen levels drop below what fish can need, and then you get fish kills, or fish leave the area. That contributes to what we refer to as the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, where it's just our hypoxic region where we have low dissolved oxygen because of that process.
Right. So nutrients management is complicated, right? Because we need it farmers need it to grow the food that we're all eating, but then we've got all these potentially negative aspects too. So I want to get into your research. So what kinds of projects are you working on, and what are you trying to accomplish?
Sure. So I tend to be focused more on phosphorus management and phosphorus transport in the environment, and so the projects that I have are focused on that area. One of the main projects that I have right now is looking at the effects of fertilizer management and cover crops on phosphorus loss. So this stems. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background before I get into the details of this.
Yeah, no, this is a really cool project. So please describe the whole setup for everybody.
Okay, I'll give you a little bit of kind of what led us to this.
Sure.
Okay, so one of the ways to control phosphorus loss is to place it below the soil surface. If you put it below the soil surface, then that fertilizer is not going to be able to be kind of washed off with rainfall, right? Heavy rains right after a fertilizer application can remove a lot of phosphorus. And I should put a little caveat next to this when I say a lot. A lot from an environmental standpoint may not be that much from an agronomic standpoint. Okay, so like if you look at these systems, you might have 50 to 75 pounds of P2O5 or pounds of phosphorus cycling a year through the fertilizer and the crop and things like that. If you lose 2 pounds, that's a lot. Okay,
for the environment,
because the effect on the
from the environment. But from an agronomic standpoint, that's a small percentage of what's actually out there, and so it doesn't make that much of an economic impact in that year of application and year of cycling, whatever.
Before you go on, just out of curiosity, rainwater not affect other nutrients, nitrogen the same way? It doesn't pull it as quickly, or
so nitrogen,
because that goes off, gaseous, right?
Well, you can have gaseous losses. Nitrogen is very mobile, and so it tends, as soon as the rain, so if you surface applied like a nitrogen fertilizer, as soon as the rain hits that, it'll move that down into the soil. Okay, so initially the first little bit of a rainstorm event, generally that water is infiltrating, and because that's very mobile, it moves down and it moves right down with the water, and so it doesn't get lost in runoff too much. It tends to leach more. Okay. Whereas phosphorus adsorbs to soil particles, and so it will stay concentrated in that surface soil. And so it doesn't tend to move down deep in the soil, but tends to move off in runoff. And furthermore, 2 pounds of nitrogen loss, even in runoff, is not a big deal, even environmentally. Whereas 2 pounds of phosphorus can have a pretty big impact. Yeah, so what led us to this is Phosphorus, one way to manage phosphorus or to keep it from being lost in surface runoff is to subsurface apply it. It's more expensive. It takes equipment that you have to put it down in the soil. That equipment is more expensive and moves slower, takes more fuel. Furthermore, it's hard to custom apply it that way, right? Whereas broadcasting it or just dropping it on the soil surface, you can use equipment that moves a lot faster, and a lot of fertilizer dealers will custom apply it that way. So you can just make a call, ask somebody to apply your fertilizer, and they'll get it done at a fairly economic price.
So is it fair to say that a lot of farmers in Kansas prefer the broadcast method or are using the broadcast method?
Sure, I wouldn't even just limit that to Kansas.
Sure.
Just a lot of producers everywhere. There are economic reasons where broadcasting makes more sense.
And this is in a dry granular form typically, whereas the subsurface applied is a liquid form.
Subsurface could be liquid. It could be dry too. It depends upon equipment. A lot of times there's liquid phosphorus that's subsurface applied, but it doesn't have to be. So I ended up getting a lot of questions from producers saying, well, I know you'd rather have a subsurface apply it from an environmental standpoint, but what if I'm growing cover crops, right? If I grow cover crops, will that allow me to broadcast this fertilizer? And particularly their interest is broadcasting it in the fall. They've got a lot more time to do these field operations, and so it's a lot easier to do the fertilizer application in the fall.
And for our listeners that have a non-ag background, how would you define a cover crop?
So a cover crop would be a crop that you're growing after you harvest your main grain crop. You'll plant another crop, let that grow over the winter or over the kind of the period where you wouldn't normally have anything growing in the field, and then you will terminate, or a lot of times you spray it with herbicide, terminate that crop right prior to planting the next crop. So you would have something, using a cover crop would keep a crop growing in that field year round, but you're not going to harvest that cover crop. Now, some people do harvest it, but I'm going to, from my standpoint, if you're harvesting it, it's just a second crop. Right. A true cover crop would stay out there. You're not going to harvest it.
Why might a farmer do this?
Plant the cover crop?
Yeah.
Well, it can help build the soil. It's looked at a soil building kind of thing. By keeping a crop out there growing all the time, you can see some improvements in soil biology, where you have more active microbial communities, which might help turn those nutrients over a little bit faster. It adds carbon to the soil. If you build your organic matter, then your soil, you get some other improvements in soil structure, very long-term kind of benefits of soil management to say, hey, look, I'm going to try and invest in my soil and make this so that I can continue to use this soil for years to come, pass it on to my children. Cover crops will also help with some other things. They can help manage weeds. So if you're growing a cover crop, then they'll generally outcompete, non-desirable weeds. And the cover crop can sometimes be easier to kill than the weeds. So you'd rather grow something that's easy to kill and then kill it and then plant your main crop. It can stop erosion. So there's a variety of reasons why.
So there are agronomic and environmental benefits possibly from growing these.
There are some agronomic and environmental benefits. I will say that there's a lot of discussion as far as the economic benefits, right? So the economic benefits can be tough to pencil out sometimes. It really depends upon the economic benefit would come in a long term, right? It's not
because it's investment. So because you have to plant it, and by the whatever, is the seed expensive typically for these things, or is it?
It can cost you $20 an acre,
okay,
which is a substantial amount.
It's still a sunk cost until you.
Yeah.
What kinds of plants are farmers planting?
Oh, there's a whole variety of crops out there that they can plant. As far as winter crops, looking at triticale and rye and hairy vetch, and there's some rapeseed, there's some radishes and some turnips and some sun hemp and some other things that are kind of summer crops that they might grow. It depends upon the cropping system when they would plant it and when they would terminate it.
And what sort of benefits they may be looking for long term, right?
All right, so how about the question? Does it help?
So, yeah, and so we didn't know. We did not know at all, and particularly what the effect of cover crops were on water quality in a no-till system. So a lot of our producers don't till, And we encourage that. That's a great way to stop soil erosion or slow down soil erosion. I can't say stop, but you'll reduce it. And we just didn't have any. And when I started looking through the data, there was nothing out there at all. And I said, well, this is a great question. It could reduce runoff because the cover crops are using water. Initial thought was the cover crops are going to use water over the winter. You'll go into the spring with drier soil. You'd have less runoff in the spring. So less potential for loss there as well. And so it seemed like a very interesting thing, but we thought, well, let's do a project. So we put together, we designed a facility we refer to as the Kansas Agricultural Watershed Field Lab, where we have 18 experimental units that we can measure edge of field runoff on. And so each one of these units are about 1.2 acres or a half a hectare in size. So it's a little larger than a football field. So pretty large area, and we collect all of the water at one point, and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, we monitor the runoff that's coming off. So we have equipment out there that takes measurements, I guess once a minute, to see if there's any runoff.
It's high resolution data.
High resolution once a minute, and then if there's runoff, then it triggers a sampler. The sampler collects water samples, so we can measure how much water is coming off, how much phosphorus, how much nutrient, nitrogen, sediment, everything. So we put this facility together. When I say we, it was, some faculty here. We got a lot of support from the university. Some administrators bought into this idea. I was very grateful for, and they gave us some funds to start this project. And then our initial project was funded through the 4R Research Fund, which is a research fund managed by the International Plant Nutrition Institute and the Fertilizer Institute, which basically came from a lot of fertilizer dealers around the nation that said that they were interested enough in understanding these processes that they put money into a pool to investigate it. And so we were funded through that. We've also received some money from the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Kansas Corn Growers and the Kansas Soybean Commission. Multiple partners came in and they were interested in these same questions. So we started this study back in 2015 was our first crop year. So October 2014 was our first when we kind of christened the site and said, okay, we're starting.
Is this the first site in the country like this?
This is a fairly unique site. There are other large studies where they're looking at edge of field runoff. The unique thing about this is they're very. We have the ability to do replicated research. We have 18 of these plots in a fairly close proximity. I call them plots. They're small watersheds, but watershed is, again, they're really small. Edge of field runoff. And so there's 18 so we can replicate treatments. A lot of other places, they don't have that many. So there are other sites that have, and we visited several of them, really good setups, just smaller number of treatments, maybe looking at pasture systems rather than crop systems. So there are differences.
So the replications are important because otherwise you're sort of guessing at what the causes are and things like that, right?
Don't have independent probability. You can't treat the data the same way.
Yeah.
Year to year weather variability has a pretty big impact. And so if you're going to look at it like some kind of a trend analysis, say, well, I'm going to look at one treatment and look at that for a few years and then look at another treatment for another few years, you get different weather and that weather is going to override any treatment effect. And so there are some ways to do that kind of research, comparing before and after, but it's pretty tough. It doesn't have very much statistical power.
Is there a lot of variability between the plots then? Are there a lot of other factors going into the kinds of things you're studying? Or
there are definitely other factors, the soils that are out there, the slopes, and even just details without getting into all. There are definite plot factors that come in here. Our plots are fairly uniform for this kind of a study. Okay, they really are. They're fairly uniform in size and in shape and in slope and whatever. Not exact, but as exact as you can get for an area that big.
But so then the point for looking at the year-to-year variation is that you get some ideas sort of within a year, given the weather, right? Sort of what's the range of different possible outcomes that you have. Like that's the part of the point of having that replicability.
Oh, from one year to the next, definitely. And then also, once we implement practices like cover crops or fertilizer management. You want to see how that system changes the soil properties over time. So there are some things that might have a very fast response, and then other things in the system that might take a little bit longer to change. Soil physical properties, organic carbon, those take longer times, and so you really need to look at this over time and make sure that your treatments have the same impact from one year to the next as the system kind of builds. So that we set the study up, and now we are in our 5th cropping year.
Nice. So just to get everybody on the same page, what were the treatments? So you got these 18 plots. What did you do?
Yeah. So the treatments. It's a factorial experiment. So we have 2 different factors: cover crops and fertilizer management. We have 2 levels of cover crop, which would be with cover crop and without. And we have 3 levels of fertilizer management, and this is all focused on phosphorus because that was our question. 3 levels of phosphorus management. One is no phosphorus fertilizer. Another one is fall broadcast phosphorus fertilizer. And then another one is spring injected phosphorus fertilizer. We are changing multiple things here. If you look at our phosphorus treatments, we're changing rate from nothing to with fertilizer. We're changing sources, because one is using a dry, one's using a liquid. We're changing the time and the placement. It's really a system. The reason we chose these systems is because these were typical of the way producers would manage the fertilizers. And we just couldn't replicate every piece of the system. And so we had to say, well, these are the big questions. We'll compare these systems. And so that's the way it's set up. It's really a system. And so it comes up with 6 treatments, right? Each of the 3 fertilizer managements is with and without fertilizer, or with and without cover crop, and then it's replicated 3 times.
What was the cover crop?
Cover crop changes from year to year based on when we're able to plant it. And again, this is a little bit the way producers run. The changes aren't drastic. We generally always have a brassica and a small grain. The small grain has changed from wheat to triticale, depending upon kind of the year and availability, which one we think is going to grow better for the time we're planting it, and when we are going to terminate, and what our next crop is. And then the brassica has typically been rapeseed. So rapeseed and winter wheat, or rapeseed and triticale.
How long do these studies last? We talked about fast and slow changes. Are we looking at, like we were developing a variety of wheat where it could be 10, 12 years that it would have to run?
For this study, we will go 5 years. The first year was really a year to move into the rotation and the system, right? Get the treatments established, and then 4 years of more data collection in that system. And it's a corn soybean rotation, and so that gives us 2 years of corn and 2 years of soybean. And
so what have you found?
Yeah, so this is why we do research, right? So going into this, I felt positive that we were going to see some good impacts of cover crops on reducing phosphorus loss. I will say that we have seen that, and I'll tell you my assumptions going into it. I felt that the cover crops were going to reduce runoff, and by reducing runoff, they were also going to reduce the amount of phosphorus lost from the 2 systems, or from the system. I also thought that we were doing a really good job of controlling sediment already with no-till, and so by adding a cover crop to this, it wasn't going to make a whole lot of difference. And so we weren't going to get a lot of sediment reduction from the cover crop. But we'd get some phosphorus reduction, and we'd get some reduction in runoff. And I was wrong on all 3 accounts.
Wow.
That's why you do science,
Yeah,
right?
That's why you do
exactly,
science.
right.
That's why you do it. So first, we have reduced sediment loss quite a bit. Even in a system where we typically see low sediment loss, the cover crop has reduced it quite a bit more. We get very low sediment coming off visually very clean water coming off of the cover crop plots. So that's been great. So we're looking like 70% reduction in sediment.
Oh, wow.
It's very consistent year round. It's not just in the springtime or not just, in big storms in the summer. It's year round. We get less sediment loss. Less concentration and less overall loss. Typically, with less sediment, we get less phosphorus loss because phosphorus is strongly absorbed to the sediment. And so when you reduce sediment loss, you would reduce phosphorus loss. However, the cover crop reduces the particulate phosphorus, the phosphorus that's absorbed to the sediment, but the dissolved reactive phosphorus actually increases. And there's a dramatic increase in dissolved reactive phosphorus. And so from we've got data collected now on 3 years. We're getting our 4th year now of the 4 years in the rotation. 2 of those 3 years, or actually, let me think. 2 of those 3 years we had pretty much no impact on total phosphorus loss. Cover crops didn't affect total phosphorus loss, but they affected the form of phosphorus. Higher dissolved phosphorus, lower particulate phosphorus, and lower sediment loss. The cover crops did not. Well, the cover crops have had a variable impact on runoff, where some rainfall events you'll have higher runoff losses with the cover crop, and some rainfall events you'll have lower runoff. And so typically by the time you look at the entire year, the total amount of runoff is about the same.
Going back to the different forms of phosphorus that are lost versus with cover crop versus not cover crop, is the partitioning better for water quality one way or the other, or is it too early to tell?
Yeah, that's a pretty tough question, and probably a better question for an aquatic biologist than an agronomist.
Have to get one of those on the show at some point, right?
But what I do know is the dissolved reactive is a much more biologically available form of phosphorus. So algae can access that phosphorus much more quickly and easily. They can take it up better, and so it could potentially cause a faster algal bloom. Whether or not it causes a faster algal bloom, that's what you should ask an aquatic biologist.
Do you know why you're seeing these differences? Like, why are the cover crops creating more reactive phosphorus than without?
Let me hold off on answering that question just for a second.
Yep.
The advantage or the disadvantage of particulate phosphorus is you can end up with a lot of legacy phosphorus. So it's going to move slower through the system. So you might move a lot of phosphorus sediment, and it might not be immediately available, but that sediment will get deposited in a reservoir and might be a long-term source of phosphorus for years to come.
So even if you stop phosphorus loss at some point, it's still going to be cycling through the
it's still going to be cycling through the system. And so that's why it's kind of tough to say, well, which one would you rather have? I'd rather just have less phosphorus. That's what I really want.
Yeah.
Okay. But you're definitely not, you're probably not making it any better by changing those two forms. Okay. Interesting. Now your other question was why?
Because this is counterintuitive, right? Because if you read a lot of the literature about cover cropping and things like that, it seems to indicate that phosphorus is going to be retained in the field, right? And their losses are going to be less.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, there's not a whole lot of literature out there. So there's a lot of speculation. So a lot of people want to say, there's been a lot of people say that, cover crops are going to reduce phosphorus losses. And a lot of this, I think, kind of goes back to some of the research done in conventional till, where you get in conventional till, there's a lot of erosion, a lot of phosphorus moving with that sediment. And so when you plant a cover crop and stop that sediment movement, you really stop a lot of phosphorus, okay? Because you have a lot of erosion. And so just kind of taking that same mentality to a no-till system, saying, well, our cover crops are going to reduce phosphorus loss. Previously, I had said that there hadn't been a whole lot of research done on this. And I should really preface that there had not been a lot of research done in the climates that we have here in Kansas. So the other research had been done in northern climates, such as like Norway, Sweden, Canada, areas that have substantially different climates. And they had found that cover crops caused an increase in dissolved phosphorus. and had attributed that to the freeze-thaw cycles and snowmelt runoff that they experience in their climates. So basically, you get a lot of snowpack around the cover crop tissue, it freezes, and then the next spring when all that snow melts, it releases this phosphorus. And we have a different system here. We don't have a lot of snowmelt runoff. Okay, we have some cold winters, but not a lot of snow, a lot of freeze-thaw during the winter, and so it's a different system. And so I thought, well, that research doesn't necessarily apply to what we're going to find here. And I still kind of feel like the processes that we're looking at may still be different than what they observed, even though we saw the same result. So there have been other studies that have found an increase in dissolved phosphorus from cover crops. So what is causing it here? It is possible that you could have some additional phosphorus lost from the cover crop tissue. Particularly, even though these are winter annuals, so they overwinter and then start growing again in the spring, there is some freezing that occurs over the winter, so you can have some tissue that gets frozen, could release some phosphorus. After we kill the cover crop, we've seen a little bit of an increase in dissolved phosphorus, so it's possible that there could be some phosphorus coming from that cover crop residue. We've done some research and looked at this, and sure enough, we could estimate the amount of phosphorus coming out of cover crop tissue. It's possible that that could be the source. I'm not convinced that's the only source. What the cover crops do from a runoff standpoint is although they're not decreasing the overall amount of runoff, they are decreasing the time or increasing the time that the runoff the water is in the field. They're decreasing the time of the runoff, right? So where we don't have cover crops, the runoff comes off the field a lot faster. So you get higher peak flows, just faster runoff.
Does that help explain the sediment?
Definitely helps explain the sediment, yeah. So one of the reasons why these cover crops really help sediment is because the runoff is coming off slow. But what that's going to do also is it's going to increase the contact time with soil. So it's possible that we're releasing, desorbing more phosphorus from the soil into the water, or even from fertilizer.
Do you see the broadcast applications making a difference versus the injected applications in that respect? Is there more desorbed when it's retained in the field in the broadcast application?
Sure. The broadcast, we haven't talked about the fertilizer treatments at all yet, right?
No.
So we tend to see higher phosphorus concentrations in runoff from the broadcast treatment until we apply the spring injected. And then after that, they're about the same. And but I will say over time, those concentrations, once we make our broadcast application, over time, those tend to decrease. The concentration tends to decrease. And then by the time the next spring comes around, we apply our spring fertilizer. We see an increase in phosphorus loss right after application of the spring fertilizer. And then they're about equal from there on out.
So they're equal at rate at that point. But for
Equal
total
rate.
phosphorus loss, then the broadcast
Total
still
phosphorus
allowed,
loss,
right?
yeah. If you look at the total mass, because there's been loss during this winter and early spring period, the total loss is higher.
Right. Sort of, and that was consistent with what you predicted then. Or
That
sort
was
of,
consistent,
right? Except
yep.
that then the crop didn't help.
The cover
right,
crop didn't
mitigate
help.
that at all, right? Yeah. Well, or change the nature of the runoff, right? Yeah, right.
So there was no fertilizer by cover crop interaction?
Not really, no. Nothing consistent. There have been a few years where you see some subtle things, but I would need a lot of graphs. Probably too detailed to discuss here.
Right. What's the primary source of variation then that you encounter here?
Primary source of variation.
What contributes the most to the variation that you see?
Gosh, there are a lot of things that contribute. There's a lot of variation in this kind of data. Weather creates a very big, a lot of variation from one rainfall event to the next, right? And and from one plot to the next, because you have differences. Even though I said these are very similar, still you get differences in the amount of runoff that comes off of one plot to the next. Anytime we get less than 2 millimeters of runoff, it's really hard for us to analyze the data, because we get some plots that didn't produce enough runoff. So you have to get enough runoff that you get runoff from all your plots, then you can collect all your data and analyze it. We still get a fair amount of plot-to-plot variability. These are big plots, differences in crop growth and things like that. So that contributes a lot to variability as well.
Yeah, but none of that invalidates the approach, though. You could take this approach to Malawi if you needed to, or wherever. So it has a global reach potentially, at least.
It does. It could definitely be expanded. I will say that what has helped us a little bit with our study is the factorial design. The fact that we have half of our plots in cover crop and half without, we have a lot more power to look at some main effects. So,
Did you see any yield effects? We didn't get to that.
oh, yield. Yeah, we have seen some yield effects. And there, weather contributes a lot more to the variability, because we might get 5 to 30 different runoff events in a year, right? So we'll get variability from one event to the next, but we still get runoff. Yield, we get one yield each year, and that's a factor of all the weather in that year. And we've had a few years that have been pretty tough. And the last 2 years, we've had some pretty low yields, and so our corn and soybean yields have been pretty low because of some drought conditions. And there, we have not seen the effect of fertilizer, either the amount or the placement, really strong. Okay, we have seen the effect of cover crop, though, because when you get into these years where we have less water, if you had a cover crop that used water in the beginning of the year, then
so it actually uses the water that the crop then can't use, so you see lower yields in the cover crop.
see some lower yields where the cover crop is. Yep, see some lower yields. You might also, the cover crop, shades a little bit. There's a little bit of some slower emergence. We've had some years where we get a lot of cover crop growth in the spring, even though there's not a lot of water, that it grows really well. And then you try and plant a main crop in there, and a little bit of a yield drag because your emergence is slower.
You didn't kill it off?
Well, you kill it off, but
It's still there.
So,
it's
yeah,
still
I
there.
gotcha, right.
It's still there. Yep. And so some of that is learning on our part. And initially, when we moved into this, I wanted, because it was a water quality project, I wanted to grow as much biomass as we could to make sure that we had enough biomass out there to impact water quality. I've since learned that we didn't need that much biomass. We've had some years where we get very low biomass. This last year even, we had, I don't know the numbers, but it was a few hundred pounds per acre, very, very low biomass. But we've seen some very big impacts on these heavy spring rains, even though it's not very much biomass. And so I've learned that we don't have treatments that with high biomass and low biomass, but from my observation, we don't need as much biomass as I initially thought. When we were growing a lot of biomass, that's when it hurts your crop yields a little bit more. And so we've changed a little bit of our management, and some of this, it's not necessarily even our change, it's what Mother Nature gave us, right? We had a really cold winter, that's why we had not very much biomass this last year. But when you don't have as much biomass, then the main crop can grow better.
So one of the advantages of growing a cover crop is it adds carbon to the soil, which can increase water holding capacity and that sort of thing, which is supposed to make soils more resilient to drought, right? So do you think over time you'll stop seeing the negative impact of cover crops in these drought years, or in Kansas where you have the Kansas climate and all of that, it probably won't make as much of a difference? Or is it too early to tell?
Sure. There are two sides to that. First off, we need to recognize the soils that we selected for this. Our soils, this is a runoff study, so we selected soils that are going to give runoff. But they're very typical of this area of Kansas. Northeast Kansas has a lot of soils that have heavy clay subsoil, And so you don't get a lot of infiltration, a lot of fast infiltration into this. And they're on sloping hills and things like that. If you were doing the same study on a soil that did not have a heavy increase in clay, you might see differences in the amount of in the cover crop effect on runoff. Okay. Now to your question, because we have that heavy clay subsoil, it's going to take a little bit of time for the cover crop to really improve soil properties there enough to really improve things like water holding capacity and maybe even change infiltration or deep percolation, I would say. So that for these soils, it's going to take more time. For some other soils, it might be faster.
So what's going to happen with the project? Is it after the 5th year, or are you going to try to continue it on, or? We're
definitely going to try and continue it on. We're looking at changing up some of the treatments. We'd really like to keep the cover crops in place because we are seeing some improvements in soil physical properties already, such as improved aggregate stability in the surface. What we're hoping is maybe that can move down as you get more cover crops, those roots grow down deeper. It's a slow process. So we'd really like to see how the cover crop continues to change the soil properties over many years. From a nutrient standpoint, I'm fairly convinced that the subsurface injection is really improving our nutrient losses. Or decreasing our phosphorus losses.
Making for a more efficient system.
And so that's probably a good way to go. We are in what we call a build and maintain phosphorus management system, where we're trying to build the soil test levels up and then maintain them at a high level. When I say high, it's not really high, but it's high enough that the soil could supply all of the crop requirements, and we just replace what the crop takes out. There's a different approach to this where we could mine the phosphorus out of the soil and only apply fertilizer if we think there will be a yield loss that year if we don't apply it. It's a sufficiency approach. I really think from a water quality standpoint, there might be some advantages in the sufficiency approach, particularly because where we are not applying fertilizer, we see dramatically less phosphorus in our runoff. So our control treatment, which we really didn't talk about much, our control treatment is showing noticeably lower phosphorus concentrations year-round from the other fertilizer treatments.
But probably lower yields too, right?
Not
necessarily.
In 1 year, we saw a very significant yield effect. This is out of 3 years. Another year, it was significant at the 10% level. And then the other year, there was no yield effect. Last year, the 3rd year of the project, it was because weather had a bigger impact. So there is a yield effect, but actually the cover crop had a bigger yield effect than the fertilizer.
Just shows how complicated all of this is. Right?
It is. It's complicated.
So I wanted to ask you about that part. So given how complicated this is, right? So all these sorts of questions, right? So all right, you're looking at phosphorus runoff, but there's different kinds of phosphorus runoff, and right, sort of what's the effect of the cover crop? Well, did you mean on yield, or did you mean on sort of quality of soil, or sort of so many different factors, right? And then there's questions about sort of how you translate this, right? Sort of to what if the weather's a little different, or what if we're going somewhere else, right? And sort of, or what if you're doing a sufficiency approach, right? So two big questions here, right? So given all that complication, sort of how do you translate a study like this into recommendations, right? Number one, and then sort of thinking longer term or down the line, how do you see, like, in terms of people's uptake, right? Sort of, you just did this really complicated study, right? Sort of, what do you recommend to them, and sort of, how do you convince them, or do they get convinced, right?
Sure. From this kind of a study, and particularly where we're looking at a systems approach, our recommendations are going to be a little bit more broad in general, right? So some of the things we have learned is cover crops are definitely an advantage for soil conservation. They do a great job of soil conservation and reducing erosion. From a water management standpoint, they reduce peak runoff rates. That could be an advantage from flood management, stormwater management, other things, right? There could be some other advantages from that, stream bank erosion, a whole host of other things. I'm not for sure if the impact on the hydrology is enough to impact these other things, but still I view that as an advantage. So it's slowing the runoff. That's an advantage. So cover crops still have advantages for water quality, but they are not a silver bullet, right? And from some standpoints, using a cover crop may mean that you need to pay more attention to some other nutrient management standpoints. And so when we look at nutrient management, we're looking at the time you're applying it, the source, the rate, the placement, those things. I would say that definitely when you're moving into a cover crop system, I would recommend subsurface placement of your fertilizer, because that's going to reduce the dissolved phosphorus concentration, and that's what is typically being increased from this cover crop. So as far as rate, that would be the next question that we're looking at is, can you, using this cover crop and from a water quality standpoint, can we do something different than our typical build and maintain fertilizer management and still maintain our yields and maintain our economic competitiveness, but still manage? And that's the part that we need more.
Right. Next step.
Need more research on, because, well, as I already explained, my assumptions.
Yeah, right. You don't know, right?
Didn't
That's
come
right.
true. So I better.
So we need some science. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we just look at where we're going to hit at the next step to try and drill down and improve our agricultural systems, so that we can maintain good quality water.
We hear in popular media and stuff, the eutrophication issues are becoming more and more prevalent to the public, right? News organizations pick up issues in Lake Erie or Chesapeake Bay, or even here in Kansas, in different areas. We talked before we started the podcast, where do you see all of this maybe going? All right. I mean, is there going to be governmental intervention, or are we going to need to come up with more economical ways of managing these nutrients for farmers so that they switch to this? Where do you see nutrient management going in a larger context?
I think definitely there will be more interest in reducing losses and reducing environmental impacts of nutrients. I think we see that from the public in general. And when we see more issues where the public, actually has to pay for this, whether they pay for it in increased treatment costs or something like that, then they're going to naturally be interested in stopping this problem. It's a very complex problem, though, a very, very complex set of issues.
Well, yeah, because farmers aren't the only ones that are contributing to this, the nutrient sources, right?
Exactly.
Wastewater treatment plants and all of that also, depending on the system, contribute.
There are other nutrient sources. Some of the water bodies impacted, I'll have to say, are not natural. That's a whole other thing, right? Here in Kansas, we've got a lot of reservoirs that have severe algal bloom problems, toxic algal blooms over the past 10 years that have really, really a big change. And some of that has been attributed to nutrient management. But at the same time, we have to recognize these are all reservoirs. There was not a lake there for a reason, right? So you can't expect it to behave the same as some other water body, right? Anyway, there's a whole host of questions related to this. I think in the end, it's still it's to our advantage, ours meaning society and ours meaning the agricultural community and ours meaning farmers, it's to our advantage to reduce losses. Again, reducing losses is not going to fix every problem. It's not going to make our water crystal clear tomorrow, but it will conserve a resource that we're paying for and managing, and it will, in the long run, I believe it will improve the water quality. It's going to take a little bit of while. It's going to take some time because there's some legacy nutrient that are in these different water bodies, but it will take time. It will improve it. And we've seen that in Lake Erie. when they initially made a big push to improve water quality through tightening regulation on wastewater treatment plants, it responded fairly fast. I mean, years, but they saw improvements, and we can see that again if we reduce losses from agriculture.
Great. We want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything that you'd like to say that maybe we haven't covered here? For Scott and John, is there anything you would like to ask?
No, this is your end of podcast chance to hold forth.
So I will say that as far as the future, where's this going to go? You asked about regulation and other things. I think that the future, to me, is fairly bright on this standpoint, because the industry itself, I talk about the fertilizer industry, the agricultural industry in general, the leaders in that industry want to see lower losses. They see that as an advantage to their industry. There are food consumers, or consumers, I mean, like in the food chain, large companies that are looking for ways to document sustainability of their products and water quality, making sure that that their products are produced in a way that is sustainable from a water quality standpoint is an interest. And I think there are probably people in the public that might view that favorably when they're looking at making purchasing choices. And so there are a lot of things going in there, and from different areas that I think would say that in the long run, I think we will move towards a more sustainable system.
Just quickly to tag onto that, are there, as far as food processors and things like that, what sort of metrics are they looking at for sustainability in that regard? Do you have any examples?
In regard to water quality?
In regard to water quality. Like, you can't buy anything right now that has a stamp on it that says, water quality approved or whatever. But
no.
Do you see, is that what you're referring to?
Sure. So the best example of the food industry looking at documenting sustainability is the field to market movement. And so they've got web pages, you can look at it, and they have a field print calculator that tries to document the sustainability from energy to like carbon emissions to nutrient loss, all sorts of things. They try and put all this into one thing to give their product or a grain or whatever a sustainability print. The water quality side of that is still under development. They have a very rough rubric, and I know from talking with them, they're interested in improving the metric for water quality, but it's a tough metric to approach.
As we've just discussed, right?
Yeah.
Well, Nathan, hey, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed the discussion.
If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share, drop us an email or check out our website at kstate.edu/research/global food. Something to Chew On is produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University.